Well, thanks for inviting me.
That's all right, David. It's a real honour to have you here because this book is superb, and I've been dipping in and out of it, as you can tell with all the post-it notes around the side here. Head, hand, heart. Tell me, what do you mean?
Okay. I mean, this is a sort of second volume, you might say, a follow-up.
That was very good. We out there, are we? Are we now out to the
appear to be. Hey!
Finally.
Welcome to episode 5 of
It's Your Time You're Wasting
with me, David Goodhart,
and me, Martin Robinson.
Martin, how are you? You're looking very dapper today in your shiny blue suit jacket. I don't know if the people at home can see quite how shiny it is, but it is spectacularly shiny. Let me tell you, it's mohair, I think, isn't it, Martin?
No, it's no hair, no hair at all. It's wonderful to be here. We've got a great show, actually, haven't we? Let's tell them what's on the show.
Well, firstly, before we do that,
subscribe.
Can you just subscribe? Just do that, and we'll get off your back. If you do it, benefit number 1, you will be updated about the full-length interviews. We've got snippets of interviews which we put into the show, and if you subscribe, you'll be notified when we put those on the channel. And even better, you'll be in with a chance to win a book. And this week, we're giving away copies of Mary Myatt's book, Back on Track, and Professor E.D. Hirsch Jr.'s book, How to Educate Citizens. So we're going to give all of that away, but not to people who don't subscribe. So, you know, it's your time you're wasting.
Your time you're subscribing.
It's not a waste of time to subscribe.
Hit the button. It's over there somewhere. No, over there.
Anyway, what's on today? So we start off with, we've got an interview, Martin, that you did with David Goodhart. And what's he talking about, Martin?
He's talking about his book, Head, Hand, Heart. And
there's lots of little pink things hanging out of that.
Oh, I've been reading this. And sticking things to it.
So he's a bit of a hero, is he, Martin? David?
Every David is a hero to me.
You big lovely. And then I spoke to Mary Myatt about her book, Back on Track, and so Mary's going to tell us a little bit about that and hopefully whet your appetite. And her book, unlike David's, I'm sure David's book is published by a very reputable publisher, but Mary's book is published by our show sponsor, John Catt, who are immense and obviously the finest education publishers who are prepared to pay us to say that. And we've got someone else on the show, someone rather special.
Yes, we actually have Don himself, E.D. Hirsch.
Yeah, E.D. Hirsch. And we both had a chat to him. We had a sort of fight over it about who'd get to do it. And we both won. And we chatted to him about culture and how best to go about educating children. And he rambled on in quite charming manner for about an hour. So we've whittled that down to fit into the show. But we will, of course, release the full interview on probably Monday.
All the interviews are longer in real life, should we say, and they'll all be released during the week. So that's another reason to subscribe.
Yeah, it's the same one we already gave, but it's another one. Sort of. Yeah. Anyway. So, Martin, anything unusual, interesting that you've noticed going on in the edu world this week?
Well, the usual stuff about exams not happening, or should they happen, or should they not happen this year coming up.
Yeah, there's a coalition of private schools and multi-academy trusts who are saying boo to the GCSE, aren't there?
Yeah, and also, and this is quite interesting because you can see a private school bringing in its own qualifications is slightly different to a state school sort of giving up on GCSEs and saying they don't matter and bringing in, we're going to do the one that the private school down the road has decided to do would be quite a risk, I would have thought.
Absolutely. I mean, so Bedale's school have had, am I right in saying they've had Ofqual approval for their their qualification that they've been running for about 5 or 6 years, haven't they?
Well, I don't know if they've had Ofqual approval. You seem to think they have, yeah?
I kind of think they have, but I'm happy to stand corrected. If anyone from Ofqual wants to come on the show and let us know what's what, we'd be delighted to hear from you.
You've just done a wonderful link, actually, David, because B-Dales, do you know what their motto is?
I don't. Head, hand, heart.
That's it.
Well, with that beautiful segue, let's go straight to the interview. So, Mary, thank you so much for agreeing to be interviewed. And just in case people don't know, you've got a new book out.
David, it's lovely for you to come and talk to us in our early years as this wonderful education show. And we're called "It's Your Time You're Wasting," and of course, it's been quite a wait coming into this interview, I believe. So,
thanks for inviting me.
That's all right, David. It's a real honour to have you here because this book is superb, and I've been dipping in and out of it, as you can tell with all the post-it notes around the side here. Head, hand, heart. Tell me, what do you mean?
Okay. I mean, this is a sort of second volume, you might say, a follow-up book to my last book, The Road to Somewhere, which was about the value divides in British society, or more broadly, I think, in rich liberal democracies, the value divides that have led to the kind of political alienation and events like Brexit and Trump. It was an attempt to kind of sort of sympathetically understand what's been going on through the prism of value divides. I talked about the anywheres and the somewheres, the more mobile, liberal, educated, and the more rooted, people who valued familiarity and who felt sort of connected to particular places. And that's sort of where and this book is sort of pulling the camera back and digging a bit deeper into that whole story, through the idea that, particularly in the last 30 or 40 years, we've become a kind of monoculture, that one form of human aptitude, the aptitudes connected to head, not just head, I mean, obviously head, hand, and heart are involved in almost everything we do. I mean, they're slightly artificial distinctions, but the cognitive ability and a particular kind of analytical kind of essay writing ability has become the gold standard of human esteem and drawn prestige away from hand, manual, technical craft, caring, nurturing, emotional intelligence, the aptitudes connected with hand and heart. And I mean, of course, at a certain sort of higher level, I mean, you might say, you know, for the last several thousand years of human history, reinforced perhaps by Christianity, the idea that knowledge, that reason, that the kind of the head was elevated above the corrupt and compromised embodied self. This is a very, very old story in many ways. But what's happened, I think, in the last 30 or 40 years is that we've developed systems of mass higher education in which certain kinds of aptitude have been, I think, sort of over-promoted in many ways, particularly in recent times, and others have been neglected. And not only that, but the idea of what it is to lead a successful life has become narrower, I think. It has become based around passing exams at school, going to a good university, having more or less successful professional career. Not only that, but there's also we've seen the development of basically a kind of single ladder up into the zone of safety and success through the modern higher education system, whereas there used to be lots of little ladders up. And it used to be possible to get promotion from below. You know, even if you hadn't done particularly well at school, but you were a perfectly capable person, you'd be spotted and you would be promoted up the organisation. Now you have to, in most organisations, 40% of jobs are now graduate only. Many organisations, you do not have that promotion from below opportunity. Now, many people feel excluded many perfectly capable, intelligent people feel excluded by the system of kind of mass credentialization, you might say. And my point, I mean, just finally on this little introduction, I mean, my point is not only that this has got out of kilter, but that we've now reached peak head, and we cannot and will not go further down this path. And you know, when I started writing the book, I did think it was the head, hand, heart was a slightly idealistic notion. it is turns out, I discovered while writing it, that it is the motto of Bedale School, the progressive English private school. But the more I researched the book as I went along, the more I realized that this is going to happen anyway, because it turns out the knowledge economy doesn't need that many knowledge work. I mean, that's the sort of crucial social fact that our politics hasn't yet absorbed. I mean, so much of our politics, our education politics, our social mobility politics, even our kind of economic and productivity politics, is based on the idea of this ever-expanding sort of cognitive professional class. And it is, I mean, it's slowed down dramatically, actually, over the last 20 years. I mean, I think the proportion of people in the top two social classes, essentially the kind of higher managerial professional class and the lower managerial professional class, has gone up, I think, from about 35% of the population in 2000 to 37% of the population now. So you're already seeing, and you've got other signs of this, even before the real emergence of AI, artificial intelligence, into the middling and lower cognitive jobs. Even before that, you've got these signs of the declining graduate income premium, the fact that 35% of graduates are not in graduate employment, and that's even with this very elastic and loose definition of what graduate employment is. But 35% of graduates are not in graduate employment up to 10 years after graduation. So you're already seeing this sort of, Phil Brown and Hugh Lauder talk about digital Taylorism, and lots of the jobs the graduates are going into are essentially no better paid or higher status than the jobs that their non-graduate parents went into. And so you've also got, I mean, so this is becoming increasingly dysfunctional, both economically but also politically, because it's creating a massive crisis of expectations. I mean, we've got a sort of what one might call a kind of mass elite overproduction, has kind of emerged in recent years, and that's creating, it's potentially politically unstable. I mean, I think it's one of the factors behind things like the Sanders movement in the US, and perhaps even the sort of Jeremy Corbyn momentum movement in the UK. Kids, often from lower middle class, working class backgrounds, first to university in their family, and they find they're not getting the high status, high paid employment they were expecting. And I think this is building up serious problems for the future. I
like the description, you say peak head. There's a great figure in your book about Sheffield, that in 1976 there were 45,000 steelworkers there and 4,000 students, and in 2017 there were 60,000 students and 5,000 steelworkers. So I think that encapsulates quite a lot of what you're saying in terms of the changeover over the last few years. I think you take about 50 years you're talking about, I think.
But a lot of this has happened very quickly as well, and very recently. I mean, you go back only 30 or 40 years, and it was a very, very different kind of world. Anyway, sorry.
Yeah, and I'm interested in some things you're saying, because I think class does come into this, and the esteem that you get with certain jobs comes into it. But you point out in the book that bus drivers and care workers perhaps have a lower status. They're certainly not paid so well, but they have high cognitive skills to do those jobs. But then again, are we getting caught up with the idea that cognitive skills are what gives a job its kudos, if you like?
Well, no, I don't think they do necessarily have high cognitive skills. I mean, obviously every job requires some degree of cognitive skill, but they need, you need quick reactions. You need, I mean, to be, I've got a borrowed from another book, this marvelous description of a bus driver driving from Croydon to Brixton, or Brixton to Croydon in the rush hour, and all of the kind of decisions that he or she is having to make, on the hoof. It's extremely, you've got a bus full of 80 people. You're having to drive the thing. You're having to decide who to allow on and off. I mean, this is a highly responsible and quite complex job to do. And the average pay of a London bus driver, I think, is about 29-30 grand. Compare that to, I don't know, it's a junior account manager in a city PR firm, who'll probably be on, 40-45 grand. I mean, these sort of distributional issues are not just to do with head, hand, and heart, although I think they have something to do with, as you say, some of it is to do with class, some of it is to do with just the proximity to finance. I mean, anything related to finance tends to be very well paid, and if you're close to that great sort of Ganges of money. You know, I mean, it's sort of you benefit from small little rivulets that flow off it.
Funny that, isn't it?
But no, I mean, I think no. But actually, there's a really interesting. I think we have cognitive creep. I mean, I talk about the sort of cognitive takeover over the last 30 or 40 years, and actually, it's a really good example. If you ask an economist, why is it that people in care homes are so poorly paid? They will say, because anybody can do it. And when they say that, what they mean is that they're judging that job by cognitive standards when it should be judged actually by other standards, the sort of emotional intelligence standards. But we don't have easy. One of the reasons why the cognitive meritocracy has sort of swept all before it is because it's so easy to measure, or it seems so easy to measure. In SATs tests, IQ tests, exams, it seems fair. Now, obviously, there are inherited biases. People who are more affluent, or whose parents have gone to elite universities are more likely to go to them. Private tutors, blah blah blah. So there are obviously biases in it. But at a certain sort of fundamental level, it is quantifiably fair. In a way, but it's partly that we haven't worked out systems of sort of differentiating and judging other human functions. So when the economist says anyone can do it, we know that's not true. You only have to spend 10 minutes in a hospital or a care home to know that, like in any other walk of life, there are good carers, there are okay carers, and there are pretty crap carers. But because it's sort of harder to judge, whether it's at kind of interview stage or promotion stage or kind of any stage, it's harder to quantify. Something like care is a very elusive and hard to measure thing. And I think there are people kind of in the NHS who are kind of working out how to do it better. You can measure the performance of a surgeon. You can't measure the performance of a nurse so easily. And that's partly because we just haven't tried hard enough. So I think, just final point here. I mean, the point about, my book is part of a whole spate of recent books that have been quite skeptical about meritocracy. But I think in a way I'm kind of more optimistic about it. I mean, you've got Michael Sandel has a book just out now. You had Daniel Markovitz's book, The Meritocracy Trap. You've had what's his name, Thomas Frank has done a sort of book about populism in the US. I mean, all of these books, including mine, were sort of skeptical about meritocracy. But I think I'm sort of mainly skeptical about meritocracy. I'm more skeptical about cognitive meritocracy. I mean, so it's not so much that I want to abolish meritocracy. Obviously, we can't. I mean, particularly at the level of selection for jobs. Obviously, everybody, I mean, even Michael Young believed that you have to have meritocratic selection for jobs, particularly for top jobs. That doesn't mean to say that you want a meritocratic society. Now, this is quite a subtle distinction, which makes kind of anti-meritocracy politics rather hard, because the man or woman on the street, if you sort of say that, well, of course we're in favor of, the best nuclear physicist should be running your nuclear research program. You don't want to be operated on by someone who's failed their surgery exams. Obviously you want the best people in the right jobs, but we're not in favor of a meritocratic society. Now, I believe there is a distinction between those two things, but it's quite a hard one to sell. I mean, when I say we don't want a meritocratic society, we do not want to turn society into a competition in which the most able win and everybody else feels like losers. I mean, that is the sort of primary insight of the meritocracy critics. But they kind of slightly gloss over the fact that we need meritocratic selection for most important things. And so, I mean, I think I'm slightly more optimistic, that they tend to be very good on the critical diagnosis, but don't really have a kind of answer beyond traditional democratic ones, pay people doing care jobs more, which of course I go along with too. But I think this idea that it's not just that we want to, as it were, balance merit with a recognition of the fact that all humans have value and should earn a decent wage so long as they're making a social contribution. I mean, that is true, but also we actually need to spread the idea of meritocracy into these other areas and not focus exclusively on the cognitive meritocracy.
There we go. And that's Mr. Goodhart talking eloquently about his book, Head, Hand and Heart. David, we seem to have lost David there. He's frozen out in deep. He does live in deepest Somerset, of course, so it tends to happen over there. So please look at the full interview when it comes out, because it's a fascinating thing about whether schools should be a sorting mechanism. Should we sort things in certain ways? Are we going into school in order to get kids to come out with the best jobs, and then some to come out with not such good jobs, and then others to come out with the very lowest type of job? And what does that say about what we're doing? And I remember a child I was teaching who teaching drama to, bear that in mind, said, I don't need to do this GCSE because I'm going to go into carpets. I'm going to go into carpet fitting like my dad. And his dad, being a carpet fitter, ran a carpet fitting business. Now, if it's a sorting mechanism, then he's sorted, isn't he? So he can go off and fit carpets to his heart's content. Now, of course, you could say if the industry changes, and we're seeing lots of industries changing at the moment, then perhaps his carpet fitting isn't so good, and has to move on, and therefore school might be something that he could fall back on some of the GCSEs and A levels that perhaps he'd got. But was that exactly what schooling is for? Perhaps schooling is for different things. And David talks about, in his book, David Goodhart, that is, talks about all the other things that schooling should be for. And he talks very eloquently and wonderfully about the arts, for example, and the importance of the arts, more than just qualifications. So please have a look at the interview when it comes out during the week. And if you're inclined to, also, why not buy the book as well? Or take it out of a library if you don't want to buy it. We're coming up to our next interview with, I think it's Mary Myatt. This is an interview that David did with Mary, and it's about her new book as well, which I think is beautifully introduced in the interview itself.
Hello, Mary, thank you so much for agreeing to be interviewed. And just in case people don't know, you've got a new book out. I think it's your fourth book, Back on Track. And tell us, what do we need to get back on track on? What have we swerved off course around?
Well, great to be yarning with you about this, David, and thank you for inviting me. So I've long been concerned that as a sector, we're quite conservative about some of the processes that we have in place. And I don't think we're sufficiently critical about, with a good critical eye about whether some of them are actually serving the purpose they're meant to. So I think that what's happened during lockdown has been an opportunity for many of us to reappraise what's working, what's not working. And before lockdown, I'd been working on what had been really irritating me about some of the reasons why some colleagues in some schools were saying they didn't have time to do the important work around reading around the curriculum, getting some really rich subject knowledge and resources there for their pupils and students. And so I just started writing about it. The working title, I have to say, was Cutting the Crap. And then I thought that was slightly meta and putting it out there. So I brought it into Back on Track actually properly represents what I'm actually about on this.
You make the point, Mary, in your introduction. You say that the pandemic, the COVID lockdown, shone a light on a lot of things that schools do and have revealed maybe what's essential and the sorts of things that maybe we can do a bit less of. And the first section of your book is exactly on that sort of stuff. What can we strip away, and the things that we do retain, how can we do them better? Can you give us an indication of firstly, what are some of the things that we should perhaps look to jettison, and how can we improve those things that we do retain? Maybe sort of one or two examples.
Yeah, so I mean, the thinking behind this, because I always think you need a rationale for justifying changing anything. And so I've drawn on the work of Greg McCann's Essentialism, the Pareto principle, the 80-20 rule, and Marie Kondo's decluttering, asking ourselves, does this bring me joy? And also William Morris's dictum, we shouldn't have anything in our homes that we don't know to be useful or believe to be beautiful. So to have those conversations about if we can agree that the greatest amount of impact comes from a relatively small proportion of the input, what should that input be, given that we can't do everything? So the first bit of the book is about trying to tease out why it is worth casting a lens on the work that we do, because I think we've got so caught up in focusing on the process and quality assurance being around book scrutinies and not looking, for instance, other things as well, not looking to see whether it's made any difference. So we've got caught into this trap of busyness. And, you know, I've done so many book scrutinies, for instance, with senior leaders, both on inspection and just general school improvement visits. And, you know, you're looking at children's books and you're saying, so what are you expecting to see here? And they're saying, well, we expect to see them marked. I say, marvelous. Are they marked? And they say, yes. And I say, well, what difference has it made? And I say, oh, we weren't looking for the difference.
Yeah. No, I've had exactly those conversations in, I think, very similar circumstances where people are sort of sitting next to senior leadership team members who are going, oh, this represents really good quality marking. And I look at it and go, yeah, but the quality of the work's dreadful. How can you hold that up as a great example? And then other examples where, you know, there isn't much evidence that a teacher's done a lot of work, but the quality that students are producing seems to be great. And the knee jerk seems to be to penalise those sorts of teachers. And I'd always urge somebody to go, you know, well, find out what they're doing, because it looks like it's working, and maybe see a little bit more.
So a lot of these kind of proxy activities that are being checked without looking at the substance underneath.
And you also, in the first section, I think very importantly, you say something about trust. Now, just in the chapter in question, you say that a ton of tripe is talked about trust. Trust is one of the most abused terms in leadership, and yet you also say it's pretty important. Can you tell us something about that tension?
Well, I think it's just a term and a concept that trips so easily off the tongues, and I think that it has to be lived. I mean, for me, the heart of trust is, you know, it's not what you do speaks so loudly, I can't hear what you say. So you can tell me you trust, but actually, if your actions are not underpinned by deep respect for me and my colleagues, there's no way I'm going to take this seriously. And I think it is something that really does have to be lived, not just laminated, to paraphrase Contender Charlie. So that's my real concern about it, that it gets dropped in out, it's underpinned by trust, but it's hard work. It's deep work. And at the heart of it, I think, are two things. One is knowing colleagues. Now, not in an intimate, prurient, knowing them as individuals. And that, for me, is the bedrock of trust. There's a lot of work around that. So Kim Scott's Radical Candor, the work that's come out of Georgetown University, where trust is absent, Christine Porath's work on toxic cultures. And, you know, colleagues I've worked with where they've taken this seriously, this is a huge investment of time, but it pays absolute dividends. So that's one element of knowing people and knowing a bit about where they're coming from, in so much as they might want to disclose or not disclose, but just knowing them as individual human beings. And the second thing, I think, in terms of building trust, is people in any level of seniority being prepared to be open about some of the things that have gone wrong in their professional careers or might currently be going wrong. And that's not about full disclosure, warts and all. But the paradox is that when you're open to a bit of vulnerability, it creates a sort of compound interest of people taking you seriously. And I found this out by mistake.
Right.
a very painful mistake, which if you've got time, I shall recount now.
Oh, go on.
So not long after I joined the local authority, I was asked to do a piece of work with a humanities department, and it was over several weeks. And anyway, I volunteered to do a model lesson last thing on a Friday afternoon with a group of year 8s I'd never met before, with 4 people watching me.
Yeah.
All I can say is it wouldn't have even scored 4. It was off the scale. It was so terrible. It was really appalling. So at the end of the lesson, it was so bad, I had to go back over the next few weeks actually to reclaim that lesson in terms of actually what we were meant to be doing. We had to do it piecemeal, but I obviously apologized at the end to the head of humanities who was in there and 3 of his colleagues. They said, "Oh, don't worry about it, Mary." And then I rang the head on the Monday morning. I had a terrible weekend because I'd only been in there 5 weeks. I thought they're going to sack me for giving local authority an appalling name. And the head said, "Oh, don't worry, Mary, it was marvelous." I said, "Look, don't let's kid ourselves. This was not marvelous. It was frightful." He said, "No, what was marvelous, Mary, was that you were prepared to trial something, be prepared for it to go wrong, as indeed it did.
Yeah.
But you earned a huge amount of respect from colleagues here, particularly as I wasn't running away. I was going back to retrieve myself. But I learned a lot from that. You can't get away with that if that is your normal practice.
No.
But because I'm a reasonably good practitioner, I had the results from to prove it insofar as one needs anything. You've not got to have some evidence that you're not completely useless. But if you've got some sort of if you've got a bit of authority or leadership, and that is quite an extreme example, but you open up to things that are not going to say, well, people are going to disclose far more as well. And when you've got it in place, it is amazing, but too often it gets broken.
Right. So, Mary, at one point, talking about trust. I think you make a really good point. You say if we want to be trusted, we have to trust others first, and that you say that the onus is on senior leaders to get the ball rolling by giving their trust reasonably, sensibly, proportionately to those who they work with. Does that capture what your thoughts on this well?
Yes, it does very well. So, I mean, I don't have wider literature or evidence that I can call on from this. It's really my own observation that whoever's the senior person in a relationship needs to be offering that trust first. And I really started reflecting on this when I was still in school, and I was head of RE, and every year we would take the year 8s across 2 days from Ipswich down to Canterbury Cathedral for a unit on pilgrimage. And every year there'd be at least one, if not 2 or 3 characters who are either just back from having been excluded or on the cusp of some other mega misdemeanor.
Right, yeah.
And so there was always an issue about whether those kids should go. So they always wanted to, obviously, because they thought it was going to be a jolly day out. They didn't realize how hard they were going to work. So I used to say to those kids individually, I have a conversation with them. I say, look, I know the head is not going to want me to take you because there are real concerns. I said, but I suspect I can trust you. Can I trust you? I said, because if anything goes wrong, I said, you'll be out and I'll be out of a job. I used to really ham it up. I'll be fired. Anyway, I always ended up taking those kids. Head was always pretty reluctant. Well, only reluctant after the first year. They never mucked about. Not only that, all of them went on and selected doing full course religious education. I think there might be a connection. Not that I particularly want them to, because they were jolly hard. And they were getting short course RE anyway, so I don't know why they opted to do it as an option. I think they just thought they'd get shouted at slightly less than the other options. But I think I mean, I'm a statistic of 1, and it might be, it might just be me. But I've reflected a lot on that actually people, for the most part, want to be trusted. You're paying them a compliment when you do. And actually, if it doesn't go well, you've actually got the real high moral ground then to come down and say, you know, you've really blown it because I thought you could do better than that. It's very powerful.
Well, there's Mary talking about her book. And if you want to see the rest of the interview, don't forget to subscribe, and you will be sent a notification when we upload the full-length interview. Martin, what did you think?
I thought it was a very, very good interview. Can I just say it's nice to have you back?
Oh, it was good to be back. I just, you know, sometimes you just got to go.
You froze with your face like this.
Yeah.
And I wondered what was going on, you see.
Yeah,
but,
no, I daren't tell you.
But good to have you here. This is the new media world that we're in. And,
yes, it is.
It's reliant on the internet. So I quite like the idea of it being called cutting the crap. Actually, would that?
Yeah. Well, you know, I think I said to Mary, I'm not sure if we recorded it in the interview, but at one stage, the book that I have coming out with John Catt, which is actually called Intelligent Accountability, at one stage its working title was Less Shit. So, you know, there's obviously a theme running through it.
I think you've managed to get yourself an advert in there. Very well done. Now, do you think the idea? I think she quoted William Morris in the interview about don't have anything in your classroom if it isn't useful or beautiful. You know, to paraphrase.
Yeah.
Do you think schools should be run on that principle?
Well, whether schools should be run on it, I think she was more talking about that in terms of the curriculum, that when we can't teach everything. And so when we're making choices, maybe that's as good a mechanism for selecting curriculum content as any other, or at least that was the position I think Mary was offering. And, you know, I think a lot of things get taught where what you do wonder, it doesn't seem particularly useful, and it certainly ain't beautiful.
Yeah. And also this thing about performative marking, that some teachers, I think, put in loads of lovely marking in their book and the kids don't improve. And I think that was a very interesting comment that you brought up in the interview about how some teachers, the work is clearly improving, but there's not much marking going on in the book, perhaps. Yeah.
You know, obviously in that scenario, the teacher then needs a little bit of help, because whatever, they're making lots of effort, but it isn't actually worthwhile. And I think that there's a lot of things like that in schools where we judge what we're doing, we judge what other people are doing on proxies, what's visible, what's measurable, rather than what the effect those actions are taking. And I think that's very much the spirit of the message that Mary's putting across.
I think that's an interesting connection there with the Goodhart book as well, where he was talking about measurability and why that certain cognitive tasks are perhaps easier to measure than perhaps things of the heart and of the hand, which perhaps, and certainly the arts, you know, as to bring them in, you know, tend to be moved out slightly because they're more difficult to mark, perhaps.
Well, I'm not sure that the fact that the arts have been neglected in the curriculum is down to that it's harder to mark them. I think it's more that they're, you know, I think maybe the point that I took from David's interview with you is that we deem them perhaps to be of less value because of this perhaps flawed economic way of trying to evaluate people's talents and skills and qualifications purely in terms of the amount of money that they produce. And you know, obviously with so many of the arts being subsidized, they're not particularly profitable. Obviously some music and film are obviously very profitable, but theatre not particularly profitable. Maybe West End musicals are, but we value them for different reasons, ones which are probably maybe more to do with the heart.
Well, they're certainly not profitable at the moment.
No, not with theatres having to open with it. I think I heard an interview with the director of the National talking about the fact that they're opening with a third of their seats available, which is going to make things nice and roomy, but but even less profitable.
Yeah, unfortunately, and well, unless you like having room around you, which has its attractions, certainly. So good to see that interview is coming out more fully as well. So
Yes.
that'll be out during the week sometime, along with the David Goodhart, and we'll release those, I think, on Monday or Tuesday, something like that, one after the other.
Yeah.
You can catch up on the full interview. So do subscribe on the button, which is over there somewhere, or wherever it is.
Now, Martin, we've got one more interview, but before we go into that, we've got a little regular segment that we like to include, which is having a think about what you've been reading this week. New graphic. Oh, I wanted the cutout of you looking thoughtful, but there we are in your shiny jacket instead. What have you been reading, Martin?
Well, I was looking at something called American Scholar, which is an online publication, and a piece called Teach What You Love. And it's a modest proposal. And it starts with, what we have loved, others will love, and we will teach them how, it's from Wordsworth in the Prelude. And literature, he says in the piece, literature departments should be about literature. There, I've said it. My radical response to the current crisis is out and on the table. It won't solve the problem tomorrow or even the day after, but in time, making English departments about literature, about novels, poems, plays, and the rest could begin to deliver them from their impending dissolution. And what I quite liked about this was thinking, well, what is English in schools? What is it for, you know? And often, certainly in universities, and he goes on talking about universities here perhaps, Lacan, Derrida, Foucault, they were read and taught and discussed in English departments, which became avant-garde departments of the humanities. They couldn't study Jacques Derrida in philosophy, philosophers held him in contempt. Michel Foucault had little place in departments of sociology or history, but in English departments, he became more central. Suddenly, the operative word was no. Literature professors became spirits that denied. Everyone was a debunker or in training to become one. No one who did not wish to be thought a fool could write a straight-up celebration of a work of literature, and particularly canonical literature. One approached the text as a sort of schoolroom detective, itching to find the detective guilty. And I was wondering about this. Do we still do this in schools? You know, are we teaching things because we think we ought, or because we love something and we want to share that love? You know, so we choose to put in our curriculum absolute things that perhaps Mary is talking about there. You know, things that are beautiful, things that we can love, and to share that love with the students we have. What do you think about that, David?
Oh no, as you know, Martin, I completely agree with that, and it always sort of makes me chuckle when people choose a modest proposal for their titles, because it always makes me think it's going to be a la Swift, a little bit of mockery, and obviously that's not what this is. He really does mean it, and you know the whole. Well, it's interesting because we're living in these times when critical theory is obviously very current, and it's something, you know, various people are concerned of the effect of that trickling into schools. But largely, schools have more or less resisted Foucault and Derrida and Lacan and all these other French philosophers. You know, they might have sort of crept in around the corners, but they certainly haven't found their way into the mainstream of courses in schools. But I think the thing that we do fight against is the teaching it because it's on the test, and that's more of the concern that I have. That one of the, as an English teacher, one of the things which upsets me, and I'm sorry if anyone else is upset by this or me saying so, but schools that, for instance, teach separately English literature and English language at Key Stage 4, and there are some schools which have English language courses of a separate English language teacher, and children have 2 years of being taught to the test and the terribly tedious stuff that makes up the English language GCSE, which is, I think, the worst ever GCSE. It's a terrible, terrible qualification. The sooner we can stab it in the neck, the better, and replace it with something beautiful or something useful. And it is neither, I'm afraid to say.
Well, there's radical, and you've heard it first here. That ditch English language and replace it with something beautiful. But this thing about books and poems and being able to say this is beautiful rather than this is what our kids might actually understand or something like that. You know, it's a slightly different idea. Or you know, I mean, what are the best works that we could put in that are beautiful that we could share? Well, if you love it, you're going to enthuse about it, and you're going to be able to explain to children why it is that I love this and why we love this and why perhaps you can become to love it too. Well, maybe something E.D. Hirsch would like to talk about as well.
Well, yeah, we'll get to in just a sec, but yeah, I think it's an interesting divide, perhaps, between primary and secondary colleagues. That I think, you know, maybe primary teachers become teachers. Maybe I'm speculating here because they love children and they like the idea of working and educating children. But for a lot of secondary teachers, it is that love of the subject and wanting to inspire children in geography or history or science or whatever subject they're teaching. And that somehow, somewhere within the system is very, very easy to lose. But yes,
I think you're that's a sweeping generalization.
Of course it is. And I'd love a primary teachers to come on and tell me about their great love of the curriculum and how I've got that completely wrong. We would love to hear.
I think that there's certainly a few I know, and I could list them now, but I'm not going to. Who certainly love a lot about curriculum and what they teach, and the importance of why we're teaching these things and not other things. But you know,
of course. Of course. And with that slight, I've ruined your segue because you queued it up and I battered it away like a buffoon. But we were very excited to have E.D. Hirsch come and talk to us. He is like 603, so we were lucky to get him. And when we spoke to him, it was in the evening, but it was obviously he's on the East Coast of the United States, so he's busy in the middle of his day. And he was lovely, wasn't he?
Very lucid and very thoughtful, and I think he says some very controversial things, perhaps in the fullness of the interview. Some of which you'll get a hint of in the segment that we're going to show.
But let's show it, and we can have a little chat about what we hear.
So, Professor Hirsch, or can I call you Don? By the way,
please go ahead, call me Don.
Thank you. You're known over here primarily probably because of the book Cultural Literacy, and that opens up a question. I think it was Raymond Williams who said culture is one of the most complicated words in the English language. What does it mean to you? What do you mean by culture?
Well, in general terms, I would connect culture with the term ethnicity. Ethnicity is widely misused in the United States because it's often combined with race. And I think as a bit of background, you know, I have this scientific bent. It was really science and reading in psycholinguistics that started me on this path. It turns out that as in brain studies, recent brain studies, the human neocortex, which is where all school learning and culture reside, is a blank slate. John Locke was right about that. And we now know that with some molecular certitude. And so it's something learned first. It's not anything innate. And what's chiefly learned in relation to culture is its connection with language. And then, if you don't mind, I'll stick in another bit of science, which is evolutionary biology and why it was that we, in relation to the apes, developed such a big brain, which is the bigness is that neocortex, which is a blank slate. So we were evolved to create culture, to have language and to make culture. And that size of the brain, because compared to the apes, because we interact so much with each other and act in tribes or nations, that collectivity is held together by language. And language has to be held together by culture. And the big advance in linguistics and language science was the discovery, and by the way, this is what got me into early education, was the discovery of how important what you don't hear or don't see is in language. That is, the background knowledge is needed, the right kind of shared knowledge with the speaker or the writer. You have to have the background knowledge that that writer or speaker is taking for granted, and it's usually a huge amount of background knowledge and value and attitude that is being taken for granted in any piece of writing or in any speech. I use the example of Polly put the kettle on, we'll all have tea. And that's just fine, but put the kettle on what? And what's in the kettle? And why do you need to put the kettle on to have tea? That, all of that is unsaid. And yet it's a nursery rhyme. I mean, it's so simple. It was the simplest piece of language I could find. And even there, there's a huge amount of background knowledge. And so our big brains, this big neocortex, has to hold all of that cultural knowledge or language knowledge. Let's call it language knowledge to start with. That is, to be able to use the language, you have to have all of that background knowledge. That is chiefly what a culture is, I would say.
So your 1980 book, Cultural Literacy, probably was most famous or perhaps notorious for the list of 5,000 facts that every American ought to know. And you obviously derived that list from looking at I think from the New York Times, and sort of looking at all of the things that were unsaid that in much more complex pieces of writing than Polly put the kettle on. To what extent do you still stand by that list, that approach, or is it something you think you've moved on from?
Oh, I think that just as history marches on, so does culture, and so does print culture. I like to use the term print culture because to immediately put it in a political context and say it's the culture of the powerful and so on. It's also the culture of communication. That's the key thing. I mean, nations, well, I'd like to go back to the tribe because it's the clearest way to see it, from an evolutionary standpoint. The tribe has to educate the young. The young are born with a blank slate, as Locke said, and this big brain of ours is because we're born into a tribe, and the elders teach the language of the tribe so that they can be such a fearsome organism. I mean, the human tribe was victorious in evolutionary terms because it had this ability for rapid and effective and subtle communications, which enabled it to do all kinds of things. But it is from the start a cooperative venture. And one of the interesting features in evolutionary psychology is this mixture of selfishness and altruism in the human psyche. But the altruistic is also very much a part. And let me just add a footnote that I think is, in the end, highly relevant. That is, in the social world, is a famous article by the two Wilsons, E.O. Wilson, the sociobiologist, and David Wilson, the evolutionary psychologist. They wrote an article, and the end was that within groups, selfishness wins, but between groups, the altruistic society or group beats the selfish society or group. And so both elements are very much in the human psyche. as the Ten Commandments well indicate. And so the job of education into the group is to encourage the altruistic and the communicative or the cultural. Now, I mean, you can go fast forward when you have the printing press and so on, so that the smaller group can turn into a modern nation. But nonetheless, we are evolved to train young people into becoming members of the group. That's a key thing to remember. It's the group, not, it was only in modernity that we started seeing self-fulfillment as being an important aspect of education. But the primary aspect is to be a functioning member of a tribe and to learn the tribal lore and to learn the tribal language. Is that that's a pretty long answer, right?
It is. It's very clear, Don. Thank you. We're talking about tribal groupings, if you like. Now, when tribes are set within a nation and they all the same tribe, if you like, bordered quite happily from other tribes and knowing where they are, is slightly different to many tribes living together in one nation, perhaps. So how do you talk about dominant culture or the idea of a cultural?
I don't talk in terms of dominance. No. There is. I don't talk in terms of knowledge. That issue I just learned recently was dealt with forcibly by Frederick Douglass. You know who Frederick Douglass is?
Yeah,
he's a fantastic character, and he said, "Well, the American tribe, the American nation means tribe, natio, what you're born into, it is a composite nationalism. It's a composite nation." And that's true. That was the experiment. But our founders accepted the fact that they had to adopt a new culture, a new tribe. The hero of my book, this How to Educate a Citizen, is Noah Webster, who said, no, we can't follow the English manner. They called it, in the 18th century, they called it manners, which I like as a term for culture because it indicates that it's something learned, something added on, something you can acquire. And people can acquire more than one culture. And the proof of it is they acquire more than one language. You can't have a language without the attendant, you can't master a language without the attendant culture, precisely because language requires that background knowledge, which I think is the definition of culture, the shared background knowledge. And without that, you don't have language and you don't have culture. So fast forward from that point, that if you can have more than one language, you can have more than one culture. And what you have to have in the United States, I'm an assimilationist, which is very unfashionable, is you adopt a common culture, which is the duty of the schools to promulgate. So that even though you have, and people come from all kinds of tribes in the USA, there is such a thing as an American ethnicity, because ethnicity is not something innate. The racialization of ethnicity is a moral mistake and a political mistake and a technical mistake. It's a mistake all along the line, and it's rampant in the United States to our dismay. And so the multicultural movement, I think, was misconceived in the sense that it assumed that the culture of your ancestors, culture of your mother, father, grandparents, is something you can't throw off, that it's part of your essence. Well, that I call the racialization of culture, because it's turning it into something of your birth culture. it's ancestor worship. It's kind of considered something essential to you. But that birth culture is not any more essential than any other culture you pick up. So that's the hope for the United States, that there can be an American ethnicity, an American culture at the same time that you keep your familial.
Wow.
There we go. E.D. Hirsch. And it's a much longer interview. It takes about an hour altogether, and we'll be bringing that up during the week. So please subscribe and make sure you get to see that interview. There's a lot of controversial things within that. The thing that's striking me most, I suppose, from that snippet is the blank slate idea. And I wonder about this. If it makes culture seem very separate to us, it's almost not joined to us, it's just something that comes into us. But I wonder about the role of the emotions, and particularly if you think about music. We feel music, we feel it quite deeply sometimes in certain pieces of music. It does music attract us in a way that's beyond the blank slate? Perhaps we're dancing to it because of something innate.
Well, I think that's probably true. It's probably fair to say we have an innate capacity for creating culture, but the culture we create is clearly external to any individual, and how and where and we're born governs our actual cultural experiences. But it's probably reasonably fair to say that everybody has some sort of capacity to responding to music, but you only have to look at how different music is in different parts of the planet.
It is different, but why have we started to create culture if it's not something within us that we wanted to do? Why? There was a fascinating program, I think, on Melvin Bragg's program during the week. I've forgotten what it's called. Excellent program on Radio 4, and he was talking there about cave paintings. Now, why cave paintings? Why did we get to that point where Neanderthal man, apparently, as well as Homo sapien, painted on the wall? There must have been something within us that, consciousness, something about us that is.
Well, we can only speculate, can't we? Because obviously these things are so far back in the midst of times. I was reading something recently that talking about some cave paintings which have been discovered in Southern Africa, which are way older than the European one. So we've been doing this for longer than had been originally thought, and we just have no idea why people might have been doing that. We tend to project ourselves into our distant ancestors and think that maybe they were decorating caves, but there's also, it's equally reasonable to suppose that it was some sort of religious significance, or maybe some sort of communicative piece of information about the proliferation of certain hunting likelihoods. We just don't know. But it takes us back to the idea of what's useful and beautiful, that there is something that chimes within us, not only with utility, but with beauty too. And,
teaching what you love. Yeah. It's a fascinating interview, and we do press him on quite a few issues around culture and that. So, and it ends up with him giving us a lovely compliment about the questions we've been asking us.
He did. He says something along the lines of, "These are the best questions I've been asked," or "How I don't normally get asked such great questions." So we felt
something like that.
Pleased by that. And if you stay right to the end of that interview, I don't know if you saw the lovely grand piano in the corner. Don gets up and does a virtuoso piece on there.
It's a great Frank Sinatra. Quite amazing.
So you've got to stick it all the way through to the end, and subscribe to find out when it's out. Oh, Martin, yes. Before we go and leave you alone for this interview, we've got a prize draw to win copies of Generative Learning by Mark and Zoe Enza. I was looking for my copy to wave it around, but I can't find it. But you heard, if you want to watch the Enza's interview, then it's on our channel. Please watch it in full. Now, if you are drawn, if you see the number, the what's it called? It's an email address. If you see the email address here, if we call your name, get in touch and tell us where you want to send it, and we will send you a copy of the Enza's book. First name, Martin. Who've we got?
Right. Oh, hang on. in order to get in the prize draw, you need to subscribe. And what I do every week is print out our subscribers list. And
It's going to be a tough job when we've got thousands, Martin.
we've got thousands, mate. No, that person won before. We can't have Carl Hendrick win every time.
Give him a book, Martin. Bless him. Actually, to be fair, Carl Hendrick, you haven't been in touch to claim your copy of Symbiosis by Kat Howard and Claire Hill. So, Carl, get in touch and we'll send you the book.
So we've got Jodie Lopez.
Jodie Lopez.
Well done,
Jodie.
And Alan Harrison. Alan Harrison. So Jodie Lopez and Alan Harrison.
Well done, Jodie and Alan. Get in touch. Hello at wastingyourtime.co.uk and we will sort you out with a couple of books. There's a double whammy for the prize draw next week where you can win E.D. Hirsch's book, How to Educate a Citizen, which is an impassioned plea to do what Don believes is the right thing to do. And also Mary's book, which John Catt have not sent me a copy of Mary's book for me to wave in front of the camera. I only have a PDF. Poor me. So I'm going to enter that one and try and win a copy as well. But for now, Martin, all that remains to say is...
We've enjoyed wasting your time this evening.
Thoroughly. Goodbye. Come back next week. And don't forget to subscribe. Adios.